All right, everybody. Well, this is going to be week number 2 for the Human Geography Review Session live. So I would imagine that, I've seen from social media and things, it looks like some people are just getting started this week, maybe within the week or so. So most people are still kind of in the early parts of Unit 1. So if you guys want to go over some of the things from early Unit 1, that would be fine. If we don't have anybody that joins us, then I had an idea for some of the things that I would go over in terms of things that that cause my students difficulty, have caused my students difficulty in the past, and seems to be a general point of confusion year to year. So the first thought that I had was, if we're talking, last week we mentioned this idea of spatial perspective. That's really what you're trying to do with human geography, is you're trying to put things within a spatial context. And so being able to describe the spatial context and be able to describe the relationships is going to be significant. And so there's two terms that are used within that. You have what's called site, and then you have what's called situation. So the two terms themselves are not that difficult. It's really when you look at, especially situation in relationship to some of the other terms. But site, if we're trying to describe a place, or we're trying to describe the geographic setting of a place, then site is really what we're looking at there, because site is going to deal with the specific characteristics of that place itself. And so the way I try to describe it to my students is, whatever place you're thinking of, and you're trying to deal with site, think of the things that are happening inside that place. So, like if you've got a city or a town, or something along those lines, you just kind of draw a circle around it, and you say what's happening inside that place, or what are the characteristics of that place. So, it can be described in any number of ways. You could look at the demographics of the place. You could look at the number of buildings, number of roads, types of roads. Go back to buildings. You could look at types of buildings and businesses. You could look at the physical landscape. Any of those things would be site characteristics. Situation deals with, so let's go back to our example of a city. If I look at the city and I look at the things that are around the city, and not just, so this is where people get confused with relative location. It's not really about the location of the city in relationship to other things. It's more about the location of the city in relationship to other things, and how does that impact the city, or what is the significance of that relative location, or the significance of the things that exist around it. So how is it going to impact that particular city or that particular location when it comes to what's happening around it. Again, I don't think people generally don't have a difficulty distinguishing between site and situation. Most of the time, it's the difference between situation and relative location. And for the most part, they're the same, with the exception of situation goes a little step further, and it deals with the relationship that exists between those two spaces, instead of just looking at where is something. So you're not really dealing just with the location. You're dealing with kind of the consequence of that location. So it shows a step further. So that's one thing that people often have, especially early on in the course, have some issues with. The second thing that I was going to look at, because I actually saw this come up on social media last week or so, is the different types of region. Now, one of the things you'll find with geography is that there's a lot of terminology, and so understanding the terminology is going to be very important. Not just understanding the definitions to the terms, but make sure that you understand the application of those definitions, applications of those terms. Okay, and so let's address the three different types of regions. You have what's called formal region, you have what's called functional region, then you have what's called vernacular region. Now within those, because of the way geography works, you actually have different terms that mean exactly the same thing. So together, you have the uniform and the formal region. So uniform and formal. You have what's called the functional and the nodal region. Those two go together, functional, nodal. And you have the vernacular or the perceptual region. Okay. And the reason I give both sets of terms is because, number one, you never really know which one the human geography test is going to use. Number two, sometimes I think that the alternate terminology actually helps you understand the term better. So, if we take the first one, for example, the formal region, also called the uniform region. I actually like uniform better because it helps you understand the space better, because when you talk about formal or uniform, all you're really dealing with is a space that has common characteristics, and those common characteristics could be any number of things. It could be the culture that's there, it could be economic conditions, it could be physical geography. It doesn't really matter. We're picking one specific feature and we're looking at the space and seeing which spaces have uniform characteristics. The other thing that's significant to remember is that when we're talking about these regions, really all you're trying to do is separate different spaces for study. And so you're looking at the map and you're saying how across the space we know that things are different. Well, in what ways are they different? How can we separate them and categorize them so they're easier to study, and so it's easier to see differentiation across space. And so that's what's happening with the regionalization process. I don't know that don't get terribly bogged down in wrapping your mind around, which is, in specific scenarios, which is this type of region. The conversation I saw was a state and referring to like a country. And this has always been a question, I'm not really sure. Is it a formal region or is it a functional region? That's a good question, because they talk about, well, the uniformity is the laws that it has to follow, and it has the same level of type of governance and all those other kinds of things, and so therefore it should be a uniform region. I guess so, maybe. I guess it really depends on which state you're talking about, especially if you look at, like, the United States. We have the federal government, we have local governments. Now, of course, the federal government supersedes all local laws, I guess, with the exception of certain states and marijuana. We're not really sure what's going on with that. But anyway, so that would be the idea. And then you also have people say, well, it's a functional region. It's a functional region because the government seat is the node, and then everything operates around that, and that's what holds that region together. So I don't know. I tend to like the functional a little bit better than the uniform. I think it makes more sense, but I think people still argue about that. I don't know necessarily that's as important, as long as you can have the conversation and explain why you would think that it would be a functional versus why you think it would be a formal. So the next one, so I've already mentioned functional or nodal. Again, I like the term nodal better because what it does is it helps you understand that there's a point of reference. And the interesting thing about a nodal region is that it is only that point that unifies the entire region. So it's really the only common characteristic that exists. So the way it's defined is it's an area that is unified by a specific node or a specific point on the surface of the Earth. Now, some things that might be helpful are that when you look at nodal regions or functional regions, they're almost, well, I can't think of a situation when it's not, but they're man-made. Okay, and what I mean by that is it is different operations that man has put on the landscape that is going to unify that particular space. So almost any type of economic space is going to be, let's say economic space, market space, is going to be a functional region, because you have the place of business, whatever that happens to be. I always like to talk about the pizza delivery stores. You have the pizza delivery store is in the middle, right? And then it has the area that it delivers to. You have the grocery store in the market area that it is trying to serve. And so all of those would be functional regions. Later on in the course, when you get to Dr. Stoller's model, it'll be a series of functional regions that are tying things together. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't other characteristics that are similar and should bring it together. But what it means is in the nodal region, you're specifically looking at that one thing that's going to unify the space. And so between those two, the formal region can be both found in the natural world and unified by natural features, and also man-made features, specifically economic activities. And when I say, so the difference I mean between economic activities and market space is economic activities meaning similar types of economic activities. So you have that type of businesses happening across the space. Market areas being not types of businesses, but a specific business. So a singular pizza delivery store, a singular grocery store, a singular. We don't have video stores anymore, do we? I heard there was one Blockbuster still open. So a singular red box, you might find it. So anyway, those probably won't be around much longer either. And then the last one is your vernacular, your perceptual region. So this is the one that maybe is a little bit harder in terms of, I mean, it's easy to define, but it's a little bit harder to come up with examples for because the fact that it really exists within the minds of every individual and how they perceive the space. So vernacular regions or perceptual regions are simply a space that is unified based upon people's perceptions of that space. So whether or not there's an actual link that exists between the space, there doesn't have to be. It's just about whether or not people think there is. And so you can go across the room, you can go across groups of people, and each of them can have different definitions for different spaces. Some people may not care. Doesn't mean there's not a vernacular region there. I teach in the South, and it's interesting, the community I live in, every year people care less and less about what it means to be a part of the South. Traditional Southerners who have been living in the South, for multiple generations, typically care about which states are considered Southern, what Southern culture is like, and those kinds of things. And people who have moved, I live in a community where a lot of people move from outside the region. They just don't give a flip. They don't find the South to be all that interesting. They're not too big on the South. It's just because their parents moved here, or they moved here because of their job. And so to them, it's not that big of a deal. And so that the South is generally the one we use a lot because of kind of the disputed claims between and disputed definitions of what it means to be part of the South. I've started using the Middle East as a perceptual region because the idea being that even the concept of Middle East is kind of perceptual in that it's not really the Middle East. The question is always like middle of what, east of what. Southwest Asia is a much more specific, probably correct terminology, but you ask like how are you unifying the Middle East? Is it based on religion? Well, there's a lot of different religious groups in the Middle East. Are you basing it upon culture? Well, there's a lot of different cultural groups between the Arabs and the Persians, and a variety of other groups that are there. And if you're going to include Islam, then of course North Africa would be. It would be accurate to try and include at least North Africa because it's it's very similar to most states in the Middle East. So that's one that I've gone to here in the recent past just to help them understand in terms of perception of a space that it's not terribly accurate, but even perceptual regions are helpful to us in terms of understanding how we understand space in different spaces across the world. And so if we look across those from formal to functional vernacular, from uniform, nodal to perceptual, one of the interesting things that we find is that if you look at which ones are most likely to change, they actually kind of move across. So the ones that are least likely to change are the formal regions, because you have to talk about changing entire groups of culture or geography. Less likely to change. Functional regions are more likely to change than the uniform region because it just depends on the change of activities within the space, so that changes over time. Plus, like I said, it's actually imposed on the landscape by humans, and so human activity changes over time. And then perceptual regions are the ones that are most likely to change because, what's most likely to change? My perception of places and my understanding about places as I either know more or less about particular spaces. So those are just a couple of ideas that I've seen across the years that students might have some issues with, some early ideas, help you understand how we study space, ideas, spatial analysis, spatial interaction. So that's the end of Human Geography Review Session number 2. So if you guys are having a great year, if you ever have any questions or you want to participate in the review session, just hop on here, start shooting me some questions. I'll do the best I can to answer them and help you through the course. So hope you guys have a great rest of the week. Thanks for watching. And as always, hope to see you next time.